A abertura do ano académico. Já perceberam que eu não sou a Karin Wall e que a Karin Wall não está aqui. A Karin está com Covid. Pois é, no último dia de isolamento, ela está bem. Os primeiros dias não se sentiu nada bem, mas por prudência, evidentemente, e respeito por nós todos, ela decidiu ficar em casa. Espero que ela nos esteja a ver no YouTube. Desejo-lhe as melhoras e as melhores saudações académicas, e eu ofereci-me para ler o discurso que ela tinha escrito. Vou dizer, procurar ser o mais fiel possível. Onde eu vou falhar é no sotaque inglês, como é óbvio, mas isso tem que me desculpar. Então, diz a Karin: boa tarde a todos e a todas, bem-vindos à abertura do ano académico 2022-2023 e bem-vindos ao auditório Sedas Nunes. É uma enorme alegria podermos estar juntos outra vez. Precisamos de voltar ao presencial, de interagir, de partilhar ideias e de debater controvérsias na presença uns dos outros, principalmente aqui no ICS e não só à distância. É importante para as relações humanas, para a coesão das equipas e dos serviços, para repor e reforçar a confiança, e é importante, sobretudo, para a ciência que produzimos, que exige diálogo, criatividade, conhecimento mútuo, integração. Ou seja, as dimensões sociais, institucionais e humanas são, como a pandemia nos mostrou, uma condição fundamental do bom funcionamento da ciência e da excelência da produção científica. Queria começar por cumprimentar os estudantes, os investigadores e os técnicos e funcionários do ICS. Cumprimentar os colegas e estudantes de outras escolas aqui presentes. Cumprimentar e agradecer aos investigadores do grupo de investigação SPARC, que coordenaram este ano a palestra Sedas Nunes, em particular ao professor Rui Costa Lopes. E queria, claro, cumprimentar o nosso conferencista. Dear Professor Rupert Brown, on behalf of ICS, I would like to welcome you to the formal opening of the academic year, to thank you warmly for accepting our invitation to be our very special keynote speaker today, and also for accepting the challenge of helping us to think about a crucial issue for democratic societies and human rights today: how hate and hate crime is a prevalent and growing problem in many societies, and in particular, how this impacts its victims. The pandemic crisis, climate change, the war, the energy crisis have brought additional challenges to us all as social scientists, challenges that we have to understand and interpret. The increased barriers to democracy and solidarity, the decline in social cohesion, tolerance and mental well-being, the changing boundaries between private and public spaces, the complexities of new ideological tensions. Your seminal work in the field of prejudice and discriminatory behaviours, with a recent focus on hate crime, is therefore ever more important, not only to explore identity and difference in contemporary societies, but also to understand how intergroup relations and emotions are changing and becoming more turbulent in the context of the multiple crises we are experiencing in the world today. So thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us, and to have you with us at a time and on a day that is very special for ICS. It's the day when we receive and greet the new students. And it's also a day when we bring together the ICS community to think about and debate a relevant issue from the point of view of contemporary societies. It's also a special day, as I was saying in Portuguese, because this year we are back together again in the auditorium and you are here with us. Na abertura no ano académico, queria também dirigir uma mensagem especial aos estudantes em duas notas breves. Em primeiro lugar, uma palavra de entusiasmo e empenhamento para a realização das vossas teses de doutoramento, para a ciência que vão produzir. Fazer um doutoramento é um desafio exigente, que implica adquirir e pôr em prática competências teóricas, tratar e interpretar dados, treinar a escrita e a capacidade de comunicação, aprender a publicar, mas fazer um doutoramento é muito mais do que isso. É saber combinar autonomia individual e trabalho em equipa. É aprender a praticar a dúvida sistemática que está na base do processo científico. A ciência é produção de conhecimento organizado e comprovado, mas sempre questionável, aberta à crítica, uma crítica salutar e estimulante. É aprender a articular as disciplinas e as temáticas científicas, o que torna o processo de investigação mais desafiador é também isso. É o encontro do nosso objeto de estudo, da disciplina de onde partimos, com outros conhecimentos, outras ideias, outros questionamentos. As respostas, o afinar dos resultados, alimentam-se também desse encontro. Por último, fazer um doutoramento é aprender a fazer pontos com outros coletivos, outros atores, organismos públicos, autarquias, movimentos sociais, associações da sociedade civil, empresas, que vão receber e apropriar-se do conhecimento produzido, projetando-o para a sociedade, para as políticas públicas, para a capacidade de produzir respostas a problemas sociais emergentes que não se colocam apenas no plano local e nacional, mas também no plano europeu e no plano global. Uma segunda e última nota para vos falar muito brevemente do ICS. O ICS, enquanto laboratório de investigação, é o vosso primeiro coletivo de enquadramento que vos orienta do ponto de vista da prática científica, do que é fazer investigação, do pensamento crítico, dos desafios metodológicos e éticos da ciência e do diálogo com a sociedade. O enquadramento situa-se, por isso, não só ao nível dos alunos e dos professores do vosso programa de doutoramento, mas também ao nível da comunidade ICS, ao nível dos grupos de investigação, dos outros estudantes de doutoramento, das infraestruturas do ICS, como os observadores, como os observatórios, os arquivos, também há observadores, os observatórios, os arquivos, a biblioteca, as edições dos seminários e das conferências, por exemplo, os seminários que tratam especificamente dos problemas éticos da investigação. Para terminar, 2 agradecimentos e uma mensagem. Um agradecimento a todos os investigadores e técnicos do ICS que recebem, acolhem e formam os nossos estudantes. Um agradecimento especial aos serviços académicos pelo trabalho incansável, à Maria Goretti, ao João e ao Daniel. Um agradecimento especial também a todos os investigadores formadores, os que coordenam e organizam as ofertas formativas dentro e fora do ICS e todos os que orientam teses de mestrado e de doutoramento. Um agradecimento à Comissão de Extensão Universitária do ICS e ao seu coordenador, o professor Rui Costa Lopes, pela organização do Prémio ECS, o Prémio Extensão em Ciências Sociais, que vai ser atribuído hoje. Para os estudantes, uma mensagem final de estímulo. Pratiquem o pensamento crítico e criativo, cultivem a responsabilidade, a transparência e a partilha de saberes e de perspectivas, procurem equipas e orientadores que devolvem a iniciativa e a confiança. Espero que encontrem no ICS um ambiente de trabalho estimulante e acolhedor que vos permita aprender, investigar, partilhar saberes. Contem com o ICS para vos dar apoio em caso de dúvidas, na elaboração dos projetos doutorais e também nos problemas relacionados com a saúde e a segurança no contexto de pandemia e de crise. Esperamos todos juntos, investigadores que ensinam e orientam, profissionais técnicos e administrativos que prestam apoio, contribuir para que o percurso de doutoramento que iniciam este ano seja bem sucedido. Obrigada, Karin Wall. A Joana Sá Couto, que vai intervir em nome dos estudantes do ICS.
Obrigada. Começo por cumprimentar a doutora Ana Nunes de Almeida, doutor Miguel, obrigada pelo convite por estar aqui. Quero cumprimentar todos os presentes, investigadores, investigadoras, o pilar desta instituição que é o corpo técnico, e de facto é um prazer estar aqui a participar naquilo que é anualmente o arranque simbólico das nossas atividades. Aos meus colegas doutorandos que iniciam a sua jornada, independentemente do programa doutoral que estão, os meus parabéns. Decidir embarcar nesta jornada não é fácil, mas estão aqui. Apesar das dificuldades de financiamento, apesar de ser uma jornada difícil, longa, demorada, dos medos, das precariedades, das inseguranças, estão a iniciar uma jornada naquilo que é uma instituição de excelência, que é o Instituto de Ciências Sociais. E, portanto, pergunto-vos agora e convido-vos a pensar dentro de vós, porquê? Porquê fazer isto? Isto é uma viagem que terá altos e baixos e muitas tempestades, seja essa a gestão de tempo, a relação difícil com os orientadores, dificuldade de financiamento, desmotivação ou qualquer outro azar, mas também é uma viagem incrível, em que vão mergulhar naquilo que vos apaixona, vão poder dedicar-se inteiramente a uma investigação que vos move, aprendendo competências essenciais para a vossa formação enquanto investigadores e enquanto pessoas. De facto, os doutorandos e as doutorandas desta casa têm um papel muito, muito importante na valorização dos investigadores em início de carreira e na valorização das ciências sociais no geral. Mas é preciso também fazerem-se ouvir e, portanto, ocupar este instituto durante os anos que cá estão. É preciso ocupar os órgãos do governo em que existe a possibilidade de sermos representados. É preciso ocupar a sala dos doutorandos, no piso 1 e piso 2, ocupar o bar, ocupar o 5º piso, ocupar a bela biblioteca e as salas de aula. Principalmente agora, principalmente no primeiro ano e no início. O doutoramento não tem que ser uma viagem solitária, como às vezes gostam de dizer. São as pessoas que conhecerem aqui que vão ter um papel importante na vossa tese. O doutoramento não tem que ser uma viagem em que estão sozinhos. E é exatamente para romper com a solidão e com, às vezes, a competitividade nociva da academia que se criou, nesta casa, o PhD Shift Hub, que é só um espaço de partilha, porque, de facto, são os colegas que são fontes imprescindíveis de ajuda. Há sempre alguém que nos faz pensar no problema de forma diferente, há sempre alguém que é melhor do que nós a ver onde faltam as vírgulas, e há sempre alguém com quem precisamos desabafar e que compreenda as viagens, as dificuldades desta viagem. Portanto, não se isolem, conheçam os vossos colegas, estabeleçam contactos ocupando este instituto com colegas de outros doutoramentos, de outros GIs, façam parte do PhD Shift Hub, e nós podemos ajudar naquilo que for possível. Contem com os representantes dos estudantes nos órgãos do governo e conversem, partilhem, vivam intensamente aquilo que não é uma viagem solitária, não, mas são vocês que estão no leme. Cada um de vós controla o rumo do barco. E quando a tempestade vier, pequena ou grande, lembrem-se do que eu vos perguntei. Porquê? A razão de estarem aqui hoje e a começar isto será aquilo que vos manterão sãos e em controle. Essa é a razão que vos manterá no caminho. Não se esqueçam dela nunca. Boa sorte.
Miguel Dantas da Cruz, em representação do Conselho Pedagógico.
Ora, muito bem, Joana, muito obrigado a todos por se juntarem a nós nesta ocasião especial. Muito obrigado a Ano Nunes de Almeida, Presidente do Conselho Científico do ICS, pelas tuas palavras iniciais, que tentarei dar seguimento. Não podia deixar de enviar um cumprimento especial à Karen Wall, à diretora do ICS, que não pôde estar presente, como já ouviram, com votos de rápidas melhoras. Dear Professor Rupert Brown, we are obviously very glad to have you here with us in person, which would be unthinkable not much time ago. Finally, COVID seems to be essentially behind us, and we can now fully enjoy academic life. This is kind of true. If you don't mind, I will keep on speaking in Portuguese. Ora bem, mais uma vez, olá a todos. É ótimo estar aqui convosco, com tantos colegas, ver tantos estudantes antigos, mas também algumas caras novas. E às caras novas, aos novos estudantes do ICS, que vou dirigir-me em especial, como a própria Joana já fez. Nós estamos a receber este ano, estamos a acolher 46 novos estudantes de doutoramento, que ingressam no primeiro ano dos programas doutorais em Alterações Climáticas, Política Comparada e Estudos de Desenvolvimento, que são aqueles cujo primeiro ano funciona no Instituto em 22-23. Bem-vindos a todos. Desejamos que se sintam em casa, tão rapidamente quanto possível, e que encontrem aqui as melhores condições para a vossa formação. Vão juntar-se e reforçar o corpo de 115 doutorandos que se encontram, neste momento, a elaborar a tese no ICS. Isto significa que, neste momento, temos um total de 161 estudantes de doutoramento na instituição. Existem também, não podemos deixar de falar neles, mais 6 estudantes de doutoramento com a tese já submetida e que aguardam defesa da mesma. Destes 161 estudantes, 80 são mulheres, 81 são homens, ou seja, o ICS atinge quase a paridade plena, merecedora pelo menos de algum reconhecimento. Trata-se de um grupo diversificado, composto por diversas nacionalidades, pertencentes a 5 continentes. Estudantes estrangeiros representam 60% do total dos estudantes. Temos 48 da América Latina, onde se destaca o contingente brasileiro, com 41 estudantes, 14 da África, 8 da Ásia, 7 da América do Norte e 20 da Europa, não incluindo necessariamente Portugal, que contribuem com 64 estudantes. E esta é uma das riquezas da instituição. A interação aqui faz-se sempre numa escala diferente, mais internacional. Obviamente estamos ainda à espera de inscrições adicionais dos programas de doutoramento, que deverá elevar a população estudantil para números mais próximos dos 180, 185 estudantes. É ainda de referir os 42 alunos que se encontram inscritos nos cursos de pós-graduação, que não contribuem necessariamente de grau, e as 84 inscrições em escolas de verão. O Instituto participa atualmente na oferta de 10 programas doutorais, com exceção do doutoramento, e que, com exceção de Política Comparada, que é exclusivamente da Casa, os restantes são todos programas em parceria ou com outras escolas da Universidade de Lisboa, ou consórcio universitário. São eles os doutoramentos em Alterações Climáticas e Políticas de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, Antropologia, Estudos de Desenvolvimento, Ciências da Sustentabilidade, Filosofia da Ciência, História, Migrações, Psicologia Social e Sociologia. O ICS participa ainda na realização conjunta de 3 mestrados da Universidade de Lisboa. Mestrado em Cultura Científica e Divulgação de Ciências, juntamente com o Instituto de Educação e Faculdade de Ciências, o mestrado em Design para a Sustentabilidade, em conjunto com a Faculdade de Belas Artes, Ciências e o ISEG, e o mestrado em Estudos Brasileiros, em conjunto com a Faculdade de Letras. Além disso, e no âmbito apenas da formação avançada, o ICS abre todos os anos várias escolas de verão, como já disse, e escolas de inverno, portanto, cursos de pós-graduados intensivos virados para temas e problemas, para métodos e técnicas. De notar ainda que o ICS participa também na formação universitária para séniores na Universidade de Lisboa, algo que fazemos com prazer e orgulho, que não podíamos deixar de sublinhar. Mas, como já foi aqui dito, o ICS não vive somente para públicos universitários, como a entrega dos Prémios de Extensão de Ciências Sociais, que se seguirá, é disso evidência. O ICS dá também especial atenção à difusão do conhecimento por públicos mais vastos. Procura, portanto, devolver à sociedade o conhecimento, entretanto, produzido, sobretudo por via dos 5 observatórios. O ICS está organizado em 7 grupos de investigação de cariz temático que acolhem os estudantes de doutoramento. Os GIs, como são normalmente conhecidos, são grupos de debate científico e de troca de experiências e de resultados de pesquisa, que promovem a integração dos doutorandos na comunidade de investigação mais vasta. São também espaços extraordinários de interação multidisciplinar que nos ajudam garantidamente a expandir perspectivas e a pôr-nos em linha com aqueles que são os objetivos do ICS. Para aqueles que acabam de chegar, lembro-vos que podem contar sempre, isto é aqui mudando de registro, contar sempre com os vossos representantes no Conselho Pedagógico, a Tana Gerbi, a Luísa Coutinho, o Gustavo Gouveia Maciel. Partilhem com eles quaisquer dúvidas, críticas e sugestões que tenham a respeito da vossa vida no Instituto. Podem também contar com o Serviço de Gestão Académica, que já foi aqui mencionado, que está ao vosso dispor para vos ajudar em todos os assuntos administrativos mais complicados. A Maria Goretti, o João Pedro Silva e o Daniel Cascão são cruciais neste vosso processo de adaptação. Aproveito para lhes agradecer o que já fizeram no início deste ano letivo, a começar pelo Guia do Estudante, que estávamos há pouco ainda a falar. O Guia do Estudante é um instrumento muito útil que poderão encontrar informação muito diversa, inclusivamente legislação, com várias secções destinadas à vossa, com muita utilidade. O guia está apenas disponível este ano em formato digital, o que, além disso, nos ajuda, tem a vantagem de reduzir a nossa pegada, ainda que ligeiramente. Bem, sei que não vos vou dar grandes novidades, mas não poderia deixar de recordar-vos que iniciar um doutoramento ou iniciar a pesquisa empírica que está na origem ou que estará na origem de uma tese é sempre uma aventura incerta. Disso já falou a Ana Nunes de Almeida e a vossa colega Joana Sá Couto. Mas a este respeito não podia deixar de sugerir a oportuna leitura de um post da vossa ex-colega Silvia Di Giuseppe, que este ano terminou essa grande aventura e que está publicado, curiosamente, no blog do GI Life. A dado momento, diz ela, a tese não exige apenas entusiasmo e paixão pelo tema de investigação. É um trabalho árduo, em alguns aspectos, um teste de resistência para o qual é necessário muito empenho. Especialmente quando se terminam aulas, os exames acabam e é preciso desenvolver a tese. Muitas vezes enfrentam-se dias solitários onde se estuda e se escreve sem ter muitos contactos sociais. É importante não ter medo desses momentos e tentar superá-los com resiliência, com certeza de que esse período mais solitário também chegará ao fim. Palavras sábias de alguém que fez o seu percurso doutoral na pior das circunstâncias, no auge da pandemia, quando o contacto social estava mais limitado. O isolamento habitual de certas tarefas, que faz parte deste dia-a-dia, deixou de ser compensado por momentos de indispensável convívio. Ficávamos todos a perder, mas sobretudo ficavam vocês a perder. O retorno à normalidade representa também o retorno desejado a uma forma de sociabilidade académica que no ICS é especialmente rica. Tirem, portanto, partido da comunidade que agora vos pode acolher, sem limitações, com menos limitações, e façam-no sobretudo nos momentos de maior ansiedade, de maior angústia. Lembrem-se que todos passamos, ou todos já passamos por isso, pelo que vocês estão a passar. Lembrem-se também que dificilmente podiam ter encontrado um sítio mais favorável aos vossos trabalhos. Eu queria terminar lembrando duas iniciativas específicas do Conselho Pedagógico que são dirigidas aos estudantes e para as quais, desde já, ficam já convidados. Uma delas é o Open Day ICS, um evento que se realiza anualmente, desde 2014, com o objetivo de disseminar trabalhos de doutoramento em curso e fomentar a discussão académica entre estudantes dos diversos programas doutorais, dos diversos anos, e que envolve sempre os investigadores do ICS. O próximo Open Day ICS será em maio ou junho de 23. Esta é uma oportunidade única para vocês discutirem com a comunidade ICS de forma mais vasta. A outra iniciativa é o inquérito online à satisfação dos estudantes do ICS, que o Conselho Pedagógico tem procurado realizar anualmente, mas que teve, durante o período da pandemia, uma interrupção significativa. É com muita satisfação que anunciamos que vamos realizar novamente, que vamos fazer novamente, muito em breve, que desta vez o inquérito será em português e em inglês e que contamos com a participação de todos os estudantes para a realização deste inquérito, que é tão importante para os ajustes que são sempre indispensáveis fazer na instituição. E dito isto, não tenho muito mais a acrescentar, passo a palavra ao Rui, que irá proceder à entrega dos Prémios de Extensão Ciências Sociais. Obrigado.
Ora, muito boa tarde a todos. Excelentíssimos convidados, caros colegas da Universidade de Lisboa, caros colegas daqui do ICS e, em particular, caros colegas e novos estudantes do ICS, sejam todos muito bem-vindos. E permitam-me que hoje me dirija a esta audiência num duplo papel. Portanto, eu em breve estarei a apresentar o nosso conferencista convidado, altura em que passarei a falar em inglês, mas por agora e por coincidência e inerência das minhas funções enquanto Presidente da Comissão de Extensão do ICS, falarei agora neste momento, neste papel, para anunciar os vencedores da edição 2022 dos Prémios ECS, os Prémios de Extensão em Ciências Sociais do ICS. E antes de anunciar os vencedores, eu queria-vos dar algumas palavras de enquadramento sobre este prémio. O Prémio ECS foi criado em 2019 e teve já 2 edições. Os seus vencedores foram sempre anunciados no âmbito desta palestra, também como reconhecimento do papel cada vez mais importante das atividades de extensão nas atividades do ICS. Foi um prémio que surgiu no âmbito de uma maior, lá está, esta maior aposta por parte do ICS neste eixo das atividades de extensão. Se vocês virem nos cartazes, temos investigação, pós-graduação e outreach. E, portanto, agora com esta maior aposta no outreach, ou na extensão, surgiu então com este objetivo de valorizar as atividades de extensão inovadoras por parte de qualquer investigador ou estudante do ICS. De acordo com o regulamento, este prémio pode ser atribuído em 3 categorias. A categoria A, para distinguir atividades de comunicação e divulgação. A categoria B, para distinguir atividades de extensão com a comunidade, também chamado engagement. E a categoria U, que é no sentido que é uma categoria única para os estudantes, que é para distinguir atividades lideradas por estudantes, seja ao nível da divulgação ou do engagement. Em cada ano, o prémio é sempre atribuído para premiar candidaturas relativas a iniciativas que ocorreram nos 2 anos anteriores ao da edição do prémio. Portanto, este ano nós estamos a premiar trabalhos de outreach que foram conduzidos em 2020 ou em 2021. E por isso não será nada de espantar quando vos digo que o número de candidaturas este ano foi mais reduzido, facto a que não será alheia à influência desta pandemia, que continua a afetar-nos e hoje afeta-nos até tirando-nos a presença da nossa diretora. Ainda assim, insisto em citar as palavras de um membro do júri que, durante a reunião deste ano, referiu como tivemos a sorte de, apesar de termos poucas candidaturas, tratou-se de um lote que ainda assim incluía candidaturas excepcionais. Portanto, como veem, este ano foram submetidas 8 candidaturas, que foram avaliadas por um júri constituído por Ana Sanches, Ivalina Gomes Dias, José Vítor Malheiros e Rui Marques, e um júri presidido por mim, enquanto Presidente da Comissão de Extensão. Vou então agora anunciar os vencedores por categoria, e dado que este ano o júri decidiu não atribuir prémio na categoria U, na categoria dos estudantes, eu vou então anunciar os vencedores na categoria A e B. E no caso dos vencedores estarem presentes na sala, pedia-vos então que subissem ao palco para receber um diploma e, caso o desejem, dizer algumas palavras. Okay? Então, assim, o júri anunciou que o júri decidiu, na categoria A, por unanimidade, atribuir o prémio à candidatura Os Impactos Sociais da Pandemia Covid-19, de Rita Gouveia, Pedro Magalhães e Sofia Serra Silva. Esta candidatura foi premiada pelo compromisso de desenvolvimento de um diálogo ciência-sociedade numa altura crucial, através de diferentes ferramentas e diferentes canais de comunicação, para um público-alvo abrangente, mesmo sem a disponibilidade de recursos formais. Muitos parabéns. Podem subir todos ao palco, se vão mudar. Muitos parabéns. Podemos. Aqui está o diploma, não sei se alguém está a tirar foto, e eu vou-vos dar o espaço, se quiserem dizer algumas palavras.
Sim. Ok, muito boa tarde a todos e a todas. Primeiramente, bem-vindos, e bem-vindos principalmente aos estudantes. Eu estava a fazer as contas, eu comecei aqui o meu doutoramento há 12 anos. E queria agradecer este reconhecimento por parte do ICS, à nossa candidatura, por este trabalho de 2 anos sobre os impactos sociais da pandemia Covid-19. Esta candidatura é uma candidatura conjunta com a Sofia Serra da Silva e com o Pedro Magalhães, mas os investigadores que participaram neste estudo foram muito mais, e gostava também de agradecer às outras pessoas que colaboraram numa altura tão difícil e que todos nós estávamos a ser afetados pelo sobressalto da pandemia. Portanto, queria agradecer também a Ana Nunes de Almeida, a Karin Wall, que não está hoje presente, e, ironicamente, um dos tópicos da análise da Karin foi a vivência das pessoas infectadas por Covid-19, portanto estará a ter agora a sua própria experiência e vivência e poderá fazer a sua etnografia pessoal sobre essa experiência. Também o Rui, o Pedro Adão e Silva, a Sofia Ribeiro, a Diana Carvalho do ISCTE, temos também não só investigadores do ICS, mas também investigadores do ISCTE, a Mónica Truninger e outras pessoas que colaboraram para disseminarmos de facto os resultados deste inquérito, que pretendia monitorizar os impactos sociais da pandemia em diferentes fases, principalmente nos 2 grandes confinamentos, e numa altura em que a questão da interação social estava no centro da questão e que nós não fomos propriamente chamados, os cientistas sociais não foram propriamente chamados para dar a sua contribuição e fazer esta devolução para a sociedade, mas nós seguimos a nossa responsabilidade social e de facto fizemos questão de ser observadores. Acho que vai ficar agora o conceito Ana Nunes de Almeida 2022, fomos observadores dos impactos sociais da Covid. Queria também dizer-vos que os dados estão disponíveis para qualquer pessoa, sejam vocês estudantes, investigadores, para utilizarem, e que serão muito bem-vindos e que poderão contactar-me para depois perceber como poderão fazer a utilização desses dados. Não sei se querem dizer alguma coisa, Sofia, Pedro? Pronto, muito obrigada e obrigada pelo reconhecimento. Queria só... Esqueci-me. Quem estiver interessado em saber mais resultados sobre o primeiro inquérito, portanto, os impactos e as reações a uma fase embrionária da pandemia, portanto, as experiências do primeiro confinamento, está aqui este livro editado por mim e pela Ana Nunes de Almeida, Vidas Confinadas, com a contribuição de diversos autores nas diversas temáticas, e, portanto, foi também aqui produzido na imprensa de Ciências Sociais e está à venda mesmo à saída desta sala à vossa esquerda. Portanto, se quiserem, está disponível mesmo aqui. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado e muitos parabéns novamente. Vou então anunciar agora na categoria B, por maioria, foi decidido atribuir em execo o prémio a 2 candidaturas, e vou apresentar aqui por ordem alfabética do nome da iniciativa. E o prémio foi, antes de mais, atribuído à candidatura Food Link, Rede para a Transição Alimentar na Área Metropolitana de Lisboa, de Rosário Oliveira, Mónica Truninger e João Morato. Foi decidido atribuir este prémio pelo envolvimento local e por adotarem uma abordagem de cocriação na resolução de problemas sociais fundamentais e prementes. Muitos parabéns. Não está cá? Rosário, força. Não é nada, antes de mais deixa-me entregar o diploma.
Okay,
muitos parabéns.
Então, isso temos que aguardar aqui. Cheguem aqui mais então. Estamos aqui as 3, já explico. Alguém tira uma fotografia. Não há fotógrafo. Está ali. Ok. Está bem. Obrigada. Pronto, já caiu. Então, muito boa tarde e muito obrigada por este reconhecimento. Em primeiro lugar, agradecer ao júri. Este reconhecimento é um reconhecimento coletivo, é o reconhecimento de uma rede que eu estou aqui a representar, mas que, para além das pessoas que candidataram, portanto, os colegas que já foram referidos, a Mónica Truninger e o João Morato, esta rede, que tem como missão fazer acontecer a transição alimentar na área metropolitana de Lisboa, é uma rede que envolve, neste momento, 30 entidades e cerca de 100 pessoas representantes destas entidades, desde o âmbito nacional ao âmbito regional e local. Ela surge em 2019, no âmbito de um projeto europeu, cujo laboratório vivo era coordenado pela CCDR, pela Comissão de Coordenação Regional, de Desenvolvimento Regional de Lisboa e Val do Tejo, e é por isso que está aqui a nossa colega Alexandra Almeida, em representação não só da CCDR, que é, como sabemos, um órgão regional de grande importância para esta temática, mas porque foi, de facto, a entidade que esteve na gênese desta rede. Nós, ICS, aparecemos porque fomos convidados pela CCDR a integrar este laboratório vivo e, na altura, o Dr. João Ferrão sugeriu-me que eu pudesse ajudar, ou pelo menos saber onde é que poderíamos ser úteis nesta demanda. E, portanto, a partir daí, e também em plena pandemia, começámos a trabalhar de forma progressiva com um conjunto cada vez maior de entidades e estabelecemos um conjunto de objetivos, uma visão comum e, neste momento, portanto, temos um plano de ação para o próximo biénio, embora a nossa visão e os nossos objetivos tenham sido estabelecidos para a próxima década, portanto, até 2030. No início, esta rede chamava-se Rede Metropolitana de Parques Agroalimentares e, em 2022, em junho passado, ela foi apresentada publicamente pela Sra. Ministra da Coesão Territorial, num evento organizado pela Área Metropolitana de Lisboa, que é quem representa os 18 municípios da área metropolitana, que é também um parceiro absolutamente fundamental desta iniciativa. E, portanto, a partir deste evento público e por uma facilidade de comunicação, passámos a chamar esta rede Food Link, e foi exatamente este percurso e o termos chegado até aqui que foi submetido a este concurso e, portanto, foi reconhecido, e é por essa razão que estamos aqui hoje. Só para terminar de forma muito breve, e por todo o trabalho que tem vindo a ser feito pelos investigadores que trabalham em estudos da alimentação, e nomeadamente através do ICS Food Hub, um grupo, digamos, informal no âmbito que atua no âmbito do SHIFT. Portanto, devido a todo este trabalho já maduro, de longa data, conseguimos também participar num consórcio vencedor de um projeto que se chama Food Click, e, portanto, este Food Click vai ser realmente a oportunidade para reforçarmos a rede Food Link e, na articulação das duas coisas, conseguirmos codefinir e, obviamente, implementar uma estratégia alimentar para a área metropolitana de Lisboa. Por esta razão, este prémio só faz sentido se for realmente dividido, se for partilhado e se for referenciado naquelas que são, de facto, estas 30 entidades e cerca de 100 pessoas, a quem agradeço particularmente o gosto de, em conjunto, termos chegado até aqui. Muito obrigada.
Ora, muito obrigado. Mais uma vez, parabéns, e queria-vos dizer então que, exatamente pelas mesmas razões que já mencionei, pelo envolvimento local e por adotarem esta abordagem de co-criação na resolução de problemas sociais fundamentais e prementes, também atribuímos este prémio à candidatura ODS local, plataforma municipal dos ODS, Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. Portanto, a Luísa Schmidt, João Guerra, Madalena Duque dos Santos e Paulo Miguel Madeira, a quem convido agora a subirem ao palco também. Vou tirar a fotografia com os outros subirem ao palco então.
Então, vou eu então, muito obrigado, não é? Vou aqui falar, isto é uma equipa, não é? Deram-me o palco para eu dizer aqui algumas coisas. E eu começo por agradecer ao júri, na pessoa do Rui Costa Lopes, e também ao ICS, por valorizar a extensão científica e, através disso, contribuir para a própria sustentabilidade da ciência e da investigação. Este prémio é para a equipe ICS, que estou aqui a representar, o João Guerra, a Madalena, o Santos, o Paulo Miguel Madeira, o David Travassos não está cá, e para todos os que trabalham no projeto. É uma equipe que se tem dinamizado diariamente para ajudar a criar uma cultura de sustentabilidade nos municípios portugueses, trabalhando com eles para o cumprimento dos Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável à escala local. Lançámos o projeto exatamente há 2 anos, portanto em novembro de 2020, na altura com cerca de 40 municípios, e hoje já estamos a trabalhar com 90 municípios que estão inscritos e são signatários da plataforma ODS local e trabalham connosco. E o que é que fazemos? Muito brevemente, o que é que nós fazemos? Nós disponibilizamos hoje já quase 160 indicadores para todos os municípios do país, continente e ilhas, e gráficos que permitem ver como é que os municípios estão a evoluir em relação às metas de cada um daqueles indicadores. Como sabemos, os ODS têm metas até 2030, até 2030, e, portanto, a maneira como os municípios têm evoluído nos 17 ODS diferentes. Depois inventariamos e divulgamos boas práticas municipais e também projetos inovadores da sociedade civil naqueles municípios. E premiamos os melhores. Portanto, fazemos ações de capacitação e debate regulares com os técnicos e os responsáveis das autarquias e também com a sociedade civil local. Terem uma ideia, temos cerca de 500 utilizadores, ou seja, 500 técnicos das autarquias que já trabalham nesta plataforma regularmente, e temos milhares de visitantes provenientes de cerca de 20 países. Este ano conseguimos recenseámos cerca de 500 boas práticas municipais e um número idêntico, portanto, 500 projetos já inscritos na plataforma. E agora vamos premiar 5 municípios e os 3 projetos da sociedade civil, os 3 mais interessantes, com o nosso júri, que é um júri constituído pelo nosso Conselho Científico, e já lá vou. Este é um projeto que tem sido muito estimulante porque nós investigamos, criamos dinâmicas novas e percebemos na prática como os processos transformadores à escala local são possíveis e credíveis. E é uma iniciativa, portanto, é um projeto que conta com um exigente conselho científico. Por exemplo, o nosso colega o Luís Sousa faz parte do nosso conselho científico e, portanto, também faz parte do júri que vai avaliar os prémios. É um projeto que envolve outros, isso é muito importante dizer isto, é um projeto que envolve outros parceiros para além do ICS, tal como o FoodLink. Envolve o Conselho Nacional de Ambiente e Desenvolvimento Sustentável, o CNADS, representado pelo João Ferrão, que é o coordenador-geral do projeto. Aliás, o João Ferrão não está cá, tinha um encontro com o empreiteiro, acho eu, e portanto não pode estar cá. Com uma coisa de obras. Portanto, envolve também a FCT Nova e envolve a Startup to Adapt, da FECUL. O prémio é por isso também, obviamente, para eles, não é? Trabalhamos, empenhamos em fazer a investigação e em projetá-la na vida social e fazemos-lo com o entusiasmo que este próprio trabalho alimenta. Posso dizer isso, não posso? Então, e portanto, agora estão todos convidados para a nossa conferência anual, que se realiza dia 7 de dezembro em Lolé. É um bocadinho longe, mas vale a pena. E, portanto, muito obrigado mais uma vez e até breve.
Mais uma vez, parabéns e muito obrigado. Em termos de atribuição de prémios, estamos terminados. Eu queria só terminar, antes disso, deixando o apelo a que mais colegas do ICS se candidatem a estes prémios e, em particular, aos novos estudantes que comecem já a pensar que atividades de extensão é que vão desenvolver neste próximo ano para concorrerem para o ano seguinte. Portanto, é tudo relativamente aos prémios de extensão. Eu vou agora tirar o chapéu de presidente de júri, ou presidente da Comissão de Extensão, e vou colocar o chapéu de psicólogo social e de colega e anfitrião do nosso excelentíssimo convidado Rupert Brown. E este chapéu vem com outra língua associada, e por isso I will now switch to English so that our dear guest, Professor Rupert Brown, can follow. So, when I began studying social psychology in ICS, next door, Rupert Brown was one of those names that was frequently mentioned, and even more so once I became more interested in the topic of intergroup relations. And so very early I came to admire our guest's work. So when I went to my very first international conference, which was a general meeting of the European Association almost 18 years ago, I was obviously eager to meet some of these names, like Rupert Brown, in person, as I was already very surprised to find out that these famous social psychologists weren't all dead, as the young PhD students tend to assume. So I was expecting to see the wise and what I expected, very old Rupert Brown, and I was shocked when I was seeing the football game that is usually organized in these European Association general meetings, and then someone told me, that's Rupert Brown right there. And I looked into the field and I saw this very energetic, very eager to start the game football player, who even had those special glasses that you use when you really need glasses and still want to play football. So that was the first time I saw the respectful Professor Rupert Brown. So Rupert Brown began his studies in psychology in Edinburgh, but then completed a PhD in social psychology at the University of Bristol in 1978 under the supervision of Henri Tacheville. Upon completing his PhD, Rupert Brown took up a lectureship at the University of Kent, where he spent 26 years of his career. While there, he was responsible for helping set up their new Department of Psychology. And then in 2004, he moved to the University of Sussex. Aside from being a professor of social psychology there, he also served for 5 years as Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange at the School of Psychology. And nowadays, Rupert Brown is Emeritus Professor of Social Psychology at the University of Sussex since his official retirement in 2019. His research interests have been generically in the field of intergroup relations. In particular, he works on the social psychological processes underlying various forms of prejudice and its reduction, including very important work on intergroup contact. Also, acculturation processes among both minority and majority groups, reconciliation in post-conflict societies, and, more recently, the study of hate crime. Aside from around 200 scientific articles and book chapters, Rupert Brown has also published 2 fundamental books that have been highly influential in this field. One is called Prejudice, It's Social Psychology, originally published in 1995. The other is called Group Processes, initially published in 2000, but more recently re-edited in 2019. He has also received several awards, of which I will mention only 2. First, together with Miles Houston, he was awarded the Gordon Allport Intergroup Relations Prize in 2005 from SPSSI, so the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. And then in 2014, he was awarded the Tacheville Medal, recognizing Rupert's distinguished lifetime achievement contribution to social psychology. This is most likely the most prestigious award in social psychology, and it is attributed by the European Association of Social Psychology. If you want to know more about Henri Tacheville, who was both Rupert Brown's PhD supervisor and the founding father of social psychology in Europe, you can read Rupert's most recent book. Indeed, for the last 3 years of his career at Sussex, Rupert Brown was the recipient of a Liverpool Major Research Fellowship, which resulted in the biography Henri Tacheville, Explorer of Identity and Difference, published by Routledge. It is both a biography and a reflection on the importance of Tacheville's research and legacy, including the discussion of several aspects of Tashwell's life, even the most problematic ones. It's an extensive work, it's very well documented biography that is both interesting and informative. And if you want to hear more about this, you can come to the seminar tomorrow afternoon in the room next door. Rupert Brown is still nowadays committed to research in social psychology, and in the recent years he's been focusing more specifically in the study of hate crime, which is the topic he brings us today. And when he's not busy with that research nor playing football, you can find him in the refugee charity where he now works as a volunteer. Rupert, it is a great pleasure to have you here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Rupert Brown.
Rui, thank you for this very warm welcome. It's lovely being back in Lisbon again. It's been a while. We tried to organise this visit about 2 years ago, but something got in the way in the meantime. But it's wonderful to be here. I've been here in Lisbon many times, particularly with my friend George Valla, for European meetings and other seminars and so on. So it's wonderful to be back here. And it's a great honour for me to present this paper today on this opening of your academic year. And I hope you will find it interesting. Just to give you a brief outline of my talk, it's going to be in 4 parts. I'm going to say a little bit about what hate crime is, what we understand it to be. Then I want to just a little bit of my perspective on hate crime from a social psychological point of view. And then I'll spend the most of my talk on to give you some of the results from our recent project on hate crime. And then I'll finish off briefly with some conclusions and practical implications. So, what is hate crime? Well, legally speaking, you can find different definitions in different jurisdictions. In different countries, it's defined slightly differently, but the essence of it, I think, is well captured in this definition from the British police force, which defines it as any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or another person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice. And it's a very wide and somewhat subjective definition, and deliberately so. There's no particular definition of what we mean by hostility, so the interpretation can be any of the normal everyday understandings of the word: ill will, spite, contempt, unfriendliness, and so on. And the key factor obviously is that when somebody is verbally or physically abused because of their membership in a particular group, this is what classifies the offence as a hate crime. Now, and it can include also online abuse, and this is a growing and oh, sorry. Would you
just stand there?
Okay, I'll stand there. Sorry, yeah, my mistake. And the phenomenon of online hate crime is a growing and particularly intractable problem for the judicial authorities. In Britain, at least, there are 5 protected group characteristics which define hate crime, and these are race and ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender identity. And these are sometimes it's mutually exclusive, and we do find the phenomenon sometimes of people being victimised, doubly victimised, because they might be gay and say Muslim or some other category. Other countries may have different protected characteristics, but these are the ones that we have in Britain. And in our research, we chose to focus on the 2 most common groups that are victims of hate crime: LGBT, sexual orientation, and Muslims. These are the 2 largest categories, even though there are other groups which seem to be showing a sharper increase in prevalence. Right, well, that's all very formal. Let's have a look at some everyday examples of hate crime. Some of you may remember 6 years ago in Britain we had a referendum about whether to stay or leave the EU, and the result, of course, was in favour of leaving the EU. And within a matter of days after that referendum result was announced, police statistics show a sharp spike in the number of recorded hate crimes. And interestingly, many of these, perhaps the majority, were actually against Eastern Europeans. Eastern Europeans were a very large migrant labour force in Britain, particularly in the agricultural industry, but also in various other industries. And here's an example of some particularly obnoxious anti-Polish sentiment. This was a poster pinned up on a school gate somewhere in Britain, both in Polish and you can see the translation, "Leave the EU, no more Polish vermin." I mean, a really vile example of hate speech publicly displayed on a elementary school gate. A couple of years later, there was a very well-known case, very well publicised case, a gay couple minding their own business on a bus in London, and they were targeted by a group of young men who were taunting them and trying to make all sorts of vile suggestions, which they resisted, and then they just simply got beaten up for their trouble. And you can see how badly physically abused they were. An interesting fact about hate crime, though, is that it's not confined to particular local or national boundaries. You may remember a terrible case in New Zealand where a right-wing terrorist went into a couple of mosques in New Zealand and killed a number of Muslims. Terrible event. And you can see here, where's the, do we have a pointer on this? Oh yes, these are statistics not from New Zealand though, from crimes recorded by the London police. And you can see a very sharp spike here in March 2019, shortly after the event here in New Zealand. So here is a very good example of how hate crime has this terrible tendency to ripple out in many different communities. And so a number of right-wing groups in Britain, having observed this event here, started targeting Muslims in London. Another indirect effect of hate crime. I did a little bit of homework before coming to Portugal, and I found that you are not immune from hate crime either. I gather there was quite a well-known actor, Bruno Grande, who was killed almost certainly as a result of a hate-motivated attack. And there are a number of, you can find street graffiti, particularly on the Lisbon headquarters of an NGO. And these are just everyday examples, which I'm sure you could replicate in many other European countries as well. How prevalent is hate crime? Well, again, it's very tricky to know this precisely. I'll show you some recent data from Portugal. This is on a European hate crime website, which records police recorded incidents. And these are just some data from about the last 4 or 5 years. A couple of things which I found very noteworthy about these data. First of all, how few hate crime offences are recorded by the police. Even the most recent data 2 years ago, only 132, which I found, frankly, not credible. And there's a reason for this, I'll explain in a minute. But the other interesting or unfortunate aspect is that it's showing an increase. So 5 years ago, 48, now almost 3 times that. Now, these data are quite common in other European countries, and just to show you the marked difference, look at the data from England and Wales. These are police-recorded statistics, so this is official data, and they go from 2012 up to the most recent data, 2021. Now, they are now topping 100,000 plus. Now, obviously, Britain's a larger country than Portugal, but clearly there's something strange where Portugal's only recording around 100, we're recording something like 100,000. And even these numbers are probably a gross underestimate because everyone, by common consent, the numbers recorded by the police are an underestimate because so many hate crime victims don't actually bother to report the incidents to the police. They either think it's too trivial, or it'll never be followed up, or it's too traumatic. But anyway, the issue here is, of course, that different jurisdictions have different criteria for recording whether an offence is or is not a hate crime. And I suspect that the British police, who have for 20 or 30 years, it's been very high on their agenda after the murder of a young Afro-Caribbean boy in the early 90s, Stephen Lawrence, which was probably the first most prominent example of a murder fueled by hate. And that led to a major rethink both within government and within the judiciary. And a few years later, they introduced the first hate crime legislation in 97, I believe it was, where they defined certain offences as being defined by hate, and also brought in special categories of sentencing. So if you are convicted of a hate offence, the penalty is likely to be substantially larger than the equivalent offence that is not so defined. Okay, now we well understand the effects, the direct effects of hate crime on their victims. There's been a lot of work done, particularly by somebody called Herrick in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and it seems quite clear that if you are an unfortunate victim, a direct victim of a hate crime, you will suffer more durable and more intense trauma, psychological trauma, as a result of that, compared to the equivalent crime without the hate element. So if you're assaulted just because you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, that's bad enough. But if you're attacked because you're gay, or because you're Muslim, or because you're Jewish, that trauma is felt more deeply and it lasts longer. However, why hate crime is regarded as a special category of crime, it's because it is thought to have indirect effects on other members of the victims group and indeed on society as a whole. And we saw one example of that in that example of the events in New Zealand having effects at the other side of the globe in London. And a number of criminologists, most prominently somebody called Barbara Perry, have noted this indirect effect of hate crime, and that is why they regard hate crime as so special, because it's implicated in the relationship between the direct participants, but also in the relationship between the different communities to which they belong. And she goes on to say the damage involved goes far beyond the physical or financial damage directly experienced. It reaches out into the community to create fear, hostility, and suspicion. And it's those emotional reactions in the community at large which is what we were concerned with in our research. So, a little bit from my perspective as a social psychologist, and the perspective we took in our research was something called intergroup emotions theory. And this is a theory which actually derives from social identity theory, which is the theory first proposed by Henri Tachfeld that Rui mentioned, which starts with the assumption that in many circumstances, and in particularly when we are targeted for hate crime, there is some minimal level of group identification. And when that happens, whatever happens to the group also happens to me. It's a sort of primary assumption of social identity theory. Then intergroup emotions theory goes on to be a bit more specific about what might happen. It says that what happens is I always appraise the intergroup situation that I find my group in, and where there's a particular threatening situation, as in the case of hate incidents, I will appraise that situation, and as a result of that appraisal, certain emotions will be generated in me. And the two principal ones, according to the theory, are fear, because it's a threatening event, our group is being attacked, or anger. And of course, you might feel both fear and anger, as we shall see. Once these emotions are evoked, and remember these are emotions evoked in me as a group member, not because anything's happening directly to me, the theory argues that certain action tendencies will be aroused, will be instigated. And these actions will typically be specific to the kind of emotions that I feel, the most predominant emotions I feel. So if I feel fear, mostly we think of fear responses as generating avoidant reactions. I will seek to leave the situation, to hide, to get away from the thing that is threatening my group. On the other hand, I might feel anger, and anger has the opposite action tendency. It tends to make us approach the situation to try and do something about it. So those are the two primary behavioral reactions to those two emotions. There is another aspect of this that we were interested in, which was perhaps not only will there be action tendencies, but perhaps people's attitudes will be affected. Particularly, of course, we're interested in their attitudes towards the criminal justice system, their belief in its legitimacy, what do they think of the police, government policies, and so on. Now, I've put this up as a kind of diagram, not to confuse you, but hopefully to kind of simplify or to make it into a picture rather than just words. So the idea is here we have hate crimes that are happening out there, which I learn about. And I perceive these as a threat to my group, especially if I'm a member of one of the groups that's targeted by the particular hate incidents. These threats are then, these evoke emotions in me, primarily anger and anxiety, and we think that these emotions have specific knock-on effects in terms of what I want to do. Anger, most likely I should want to go out there and do something proactive. Less likely to avoid. So you can see if I've got an arrow in red, this means it's a negative tendency. The angrier I am, the less likely I am to want to go away and hide and get away from the situation. And there is another emotion which we don't fully understand yet, but a curious feature of victims of hate crime is that sometimes they feel shame. One can see this also in victims of sexual abuse. Sometimes rape victims report feeling ashamed. And I think it's partly because when you're victimized because of your gender identity or Muslim identity, whatever it is, this is a clear indication that society or members of society devalue you. And when you feel devalued, this is one of the preconditions for feeling shame. And there are some people who have argued that shame is a particularly powerful emotion, and it may be particularly powerful in wanting to instigate retaliation, to somehow get one's own back on the perpetrators. So, although we didn't originally have this as a very strong kind of part of our model, it sort of emerged as the research progressed. So that's my starting point, and I want to now go through 4 or 5 studies where I hope to be able to show you how that works out in research terms. We studied, as I said, and this brings me to our research program, and this was a collaboration, a very interesting collaboration for me because it was an interdisciplinary project. Mark Walters is Professor of Law at the University of Sussex, and my colleague Jenny Patterson, another social psychologist now at Northumbria University. And so the 3 of us were funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which coincidentally also funded my biography project. And we set ourselves a few questions. First of all, straightforwardly, what's the nature of the threat posed by hate crime? How much and how many are victims, members of victim groups affected by hate crimes against their members? What about the role of emotions? Does it indeed follow the hypothesized path set out by intergroup emotions theory? These particular emotions leading to particular action tendencies and perhaps also particular attitudes. And then perhaps a new question to try and get underneath that group-based emotion. Why is it that I feel fear or anger when a member of my group is attacked, even if it's not me? And we want to understand is there another underlying mechanism which leads or creates these emotions. And we focus particularly on the LGBT and Muslim community in Britain, these being the 2 most heavily targeted victim groups for hate crime. So that's our research program. Let's look at the first study. I'll dwell a little bit more on the first study. The second and third and fourth studies I'll skip over a bit because they've followed a rather similar pattern. So So it was an online survey of Muslims, and I just want to say this at the outset. I know many of you think of psychologists only ever doing work on undergraduate students, and it's boring. How can we extrapolate from those? Well, we didn't use a single undergraduate student in our research, unless some of them might have been in here as a matter of chance. But we can see we recruited over 300 Muslim participants from a couple of our Muslim partner organizations, and they were very helpful in recruiting participants for our research. Good mix of men and women. You see a good age range from 17 up to 75, and a wide mix of different nationalities as well. So in our online instrument, we had a number of measures, starting with, quite straightforwardly, how often they had been targeted themselves directly as a victim of hate crime, or indirectly. Did they know somebody else who had been targeted for hate crime? And we had two particular kinds of hate crime: verbal assaults and physical assaults. What emotions did they feel when they heard about these or experienced these hate crimes? What did they then want to do? So here are typical avoidance behaviours. So were they liable to go out in the streets less often, particularly into neighbourhoods where there were predominantly white participants? Would they change the style of dress? Would they not wear a hijab, for example, or other traditional Muslim clothing? Pro-action tendencies, would they be motivated to join, for example, an anti-hate crime action group, so actually trying to do something to combat hate crime? Would they worry about their personal security and join a self-defense class, perhaps? And finally, would they be ever motivated to retaliate directly, actually to try and get their own back on the perpetrators? And then finally, we enlisted some attitudes towards what they felt about the police in their attempts to control hate crime, the government, and the Crown Prosecution Service, which is the major judicial organisation which decides whether or not to bring a prosecution in any particular case. Right, well, let me go back to that nice figure I showed you. Before we get there, let's talk about the incidents, before we get there. So, looking at our sample, we divided our sample into three groups. Those who had had no experience at all, either direct or indirect, of hate crime. A second group who'd had only indirect experience. They knew somebody else who'd been targeted because they were Muslims, but they themselves had not. And then finally we have a third group, the double whammy if you like, people who both directly and indirectly suffered because of their Muslim identity. Looking at verbal assaults, fairly striking. We put these two categories together. Over 80% of our sample had either direct or indirect experience of verbal insults in the street, people shouting at them, all sorts of epithets that Muslims unfortunately have to listen to day in, day out. Quite shocking. Particularly notable, over 60% of them had had direct experience of this. Physical assaults, well, thankfully, much less prevalent. You can see 50% of our sample, thankfully, had never experienced any physical assault or even heard of anyone else who'd been assaulted because they'd been Muslims. But put it the other way, 50% of them had. Over a third knew somebody else who'd been assaulted because they were Muslims. And fully 16% of our sample had actually been attacked themselves because they were a Muslim. So I want you to bear in mind these three groups here, because when we look at the emotions, can we see whether these groups differ in terms of the emotions they experience as a result of learning about hate crime? Well, here's a very straightforward graph. You can see the no group is like the control group in blue, this is the indirect group in red, and this is the direct experience in green. Two most obvious things to note here. There was a lot of threat felt, feeling vulnerable, feeling anxious, and feeling angry. So those emotions were the predominant emotions, not much shame being felt. But the other notable thing is that both the direct and the indirect groups are always feeling these emotions more intensely than the no experience group. So that's evidence that these hate crimes, whether they are directly experienced or indirectly experienced, generate emotions. And it's pretty interesting to me that there's not really much difference between these two victimized groups. In no case was there any reliable difference between them. So the emotions are felt intensely, and it doesn't really matter whether you're a direct or an indirect victim. Action tendencies, somewhat similar here. You can see in every case the blue group, the control group, is different from the other two groups, and in general the two other groups don't really differ very much. So they feel more proactive, more likely to be avoidant, more likely to be worried about their own security, and in terms of attitudes, they're more concerned that the government is not doing enough, and less favourable towards the Crown Prosecution Service, and they also think the police are not doing enough. And this little box up here is interesting. Look at the percentage of the sample who want to retaliate against the perpetrators of hate crime. You can see that in the both types of victimization, over half of the participants want to engage in some kind of retaliatory action against the perpetrator group. So, these are some of the simple differences between these three groups. I want now to see if we can sketch out the links between the emotions I've just shown you and these action tendencies. And so I'm going to return to that figure that I showed you, and we'll sketch it in piece by piece. Green arrows mean a positive association, and the thicker the arrow, the stronger the association. Red arrows mean a negative association. Again, the thicker the line, the stronger the association. So we can see straight away that the frequency of indirect victimization is positively linked to how threatened people felt. And that in turn, that was linked to how angry they felt and how anxious they felt. Interestingly, when we've controlled for indirect victimization, direct victimization doesn't feed additionally into feeling threatened. It's there, but it's controlling for indirect victimization, as it were, it drops out. Shame is not linked to how threatened they felt. What happens with these emotions? Well, here you can see, as the theory, the intergroup emotions theory predicted, anger is positively linked, a big thick line here, positively associated with wanting to do something about it, join an anti-hate crime group, become more active in their Muslim association, but negatively linked to avoidance. So the more angry they felt, the less they felt they wanted to hide their Muslim identity. Anxiety, on the other hand, had a very strong positive link towards avoidance. You can see that's the thickest line of all, so a positive association there, and also a slightly weaker but nevertheless clear association with wanting to join up with a self-defense class or take measures to increase their personal security. And here, as I had warned you, we find some evidence of shame being linked to retaliation. What about attitudes towards the police and the Crown Prosecution Service? Well, this time it's only anger which seems to drive those attitudes. You can see that the more angry you are, the less confident you are in the Crown Prosecution Service that they will bring prosecutions. The more you believe the police should do more, and the more you believe that the government should do more. So it's not just what you want to do as a group member, but also what you think the institutions of the state should do. So we had 300 odd Muslims. It's not a properly representative sample of all Muslims in Britain, obviously, but we're fairly reassured that the model we're working with seems to be working quite well. Will it work as well for the LGBT community, another victimized group? Same sort of idea here. This time we've got a larger sample, nearly 600 LGBT participants. Same instrument with some small adjustments for the particular group involved. And you can see a broadly similar pattern of results coming out. This time, both direct and indirect victimization feeds into threat. Threats are associated with anger and anxiety, and this time, the more threatened you feel, the more ashamed you feel. And then these emotions, broadly speaking, as we had thought, anger leading to proaction, but negatively associated with avoidance. Anxiety was driving everything, it seems, not only self-security, but avoidance, but also proaction. And so was shame. Again, look at the link with retaliation and somewhat with wanting to join hate crime action groups and so on. So in two separate victimized samples, we have evidence of emotions being generated by being associated with threats and leading to various action tendencies. But you're all a sophisticated audience, and you know as well as I do that correlations don't imply causation. These are simply cross-sectional associations. How can we lend our hypotheses a bit more credibility to show that it's emotions causing these things, or threat causing the emotions? Well, one way is to do longitudinal research. If you separate out in time the emotions that you feel and then come back a few months later and see what they've done about it, that gives you a bit more reassurance that these are indeed cause-effect relationships. So our next study was indeed a longitudinal study, again with a largest sample of LGBT participants, 400 and something, and with a time lag of 3 months. So we elicited the emotions at time 1 and a number of other measures, and then we came back 3 months later to ask them, well, how much proaction did you engage in? How much awareness, how much did you want to raise awareness about hate crimes? How much avoidance did you engage in? How much were you worried about your own personal security? And how much did you want to retaliate against hate crime groups? And you can see we've got some evidence of these longitudinal associations now. These are associating over time, controlling for the action tendencies at time 1. Anger is negatively associated with avoidance, as before, also associated with wanting to raise public awareness about hate crime. Anxiety, again, associated with avoidance, with security, and here is shame again, linked to retaliation and a little bit with avoidance as well. So we've got these associations now not only cross-sectionally, but over time. So starting to feel a little bit more confident that it is the emotions driving these behavioral intentions. So let me sum up where we've got to so far. Hate crime, or perhaps we didn't need to do the research to know this, with police stats were clear, but hate crime is a common phenomenon in Britain, especially for Muslim and LGBT people. Its indirect effects are real, felt as strongly as by direct victims. The main emotions of this indirect victimization seem to be anger and anxiety, fear, shame, somewhat less so. These emotions are then associated with specific action tendencies, just as intergroup emotions theory had thought, to be proactive or to be avoidant, and in some cases to want to go out there and retaliate against the perpetrators. But we're still really only dealing with correlational data. And even though that last study is longitudinal, it's not an absolutely foolproof evidence for causation. And we don't quite yet understand why these indirect effects happen. Why do they lead to such strong emotions? And we had a guess, a hunch, that the reason why emotions are evoked when we read about or see cases of hate crime on the TV is that we can empathize more readily, more easily with fellow in-group members than with other members of the public or out-group members. So when it's our group members who are in the firing line, our empathic response is likely to be stronger, and those emotions then are more keenly felt as a result of that empathy, increased empathy. So that was a kind of the next hunch we had that we wanted to put to test in the next two studies that I'll describe to you. And these are both experimental studies. Now don't get alarmed, we didn't go around inducing hate crime and putting people in hate crime situations, although we did in a certain sense put people in an indirect hate crime situation. But you know, we've got a very strong ethics panel at Sussex and so on, so it was all properly done. So, and this was, I think, the first ever experimental investigation into the effects of crime motivation and the type of threat, we'll come on to that in a minute, on the LGBT community. Now, Brighton, we're fortunate working. Brighton is got a very large gay community, and every year they have a gay pride festival in Brighton in the end of July, beginning of August, where thousands of LGBT people congregate and have fun. So we set up a little stall in this festival to recruit these gay participants for our study. And there's a parallel gay pride festival in Newcastle where we also recruited some. So we got about 86 and we gave them a lollipop. Yeah, come on, do this study, you know, did a little prize and so on. And so they came along, and we had a very simple, and social psychologists have recognized we always like 2-by-2 experiments. We manipulated 2 factors: the motivation for the crime, whether it was hate motivated or simply a random crime, and then the type of crime. Was it a direct, realistic threat, a mugging of somebody, or was it more of a symbolic threat against a building or some symbol for the group? How did we manipulate these 2 factors? Well, essentially by getting them to read a newspaper article which was very realistic. It seemed to be describing a real event, and we presented, the thing is, we're doing work on street crime. Have a look at this article which describes a street crime. And here it is. Here's one of them anyway, and you see it's all mocked up to look very realistic. And in fact, the incident described are all taken from actual hate crime events in the last year or 3, and we just changed little bits of it to fit in with our experimental requirements. And of course, the key thing was we wanted just to change the nature of the hate, the motivation for the crime. So this is the hate condition: gay activist mugged in hate attack. There's the headline. It's clear it's a hate attack. Here's a gay activist being attacked by a gang as he left a friend's house. It's described as a hate-motivated assault. Here's a quote from an eyewitness. He heard them shouting homophobic abuse at the poor guy. And a police spokesman says, it's clear this is a hate-motivated mugging. Hate crimes of this nature are taken very seriously indeed by the police. So we reinforce the idea that this is a hate-motivated offence. So roughly a quarter of our sample read that newspaper article. Another quarter read almost identical, but now all the events are the same, except it's just a community activist who's mugged. He just happened to be attacked by a gang, very serious, he's left in hospital and all the rest of it, but he was mugged for no reason. This random mugging, crimes of this nature taken very seriously and so on. So the offence is identical, it's just that he's not targeted because he's gay. And then we varied the type of crime. In one case it was a gay bar, so symbolic for the gay community. In another case it was simply local buildings targeted with graffiti. This is a less important variable, as we'll see, but nevertheless we wanted just to see whether that had an effect as well. So they read one of these 4 articles, and then we say, well, what did you feel for the victims of this crime? How much empathy did you feel? How much anger, anxiety? How threatened did you feel? What do you want to do about it? Will you be more likely to go and join a hate crime activist group? Or maybe you'll be more likely to engage avoidance, stop holding your partner's hand when you go out, dress less flamboyantly, and so on and so on. What did we find? Well, the main effect that I'm interested in here is the difference between the articles which described a hate-motivated offence versus a random attack. And you can see in just about every case, sometimes at the end they're not always statistically reliable, but nevertheless, in the hate-motivated offences, they felt more empathy, more anger, they felt more threatened, both symbolically and realistically, they felt slightly more anxious and slightly more likely to engage in pro-action tendencies. And now, because we're observing these differences, and there's no other difference between the four different groups that read these articles, they're randomly assigned to read one of those 4 newspaper articles, we can be pretty confident that it's the brief experience of being exposed to a particular indirect victimization that is causing these emotional reactions. We had a few effects for the type of crime, whether it was a mugging or vandalism crime, not really very surprising. People felt more empathic and angrier and more anxious when it was described as somebody, a victim being mugged, as opposed to a building being attacked. Not so interesting, perhaps. And as before, we wanted to see if we could link the emotions that were aroused by the threat to the action tendencies. So we did some equation modeling here, where we started with our manipulated variable, whether it was a hate crime or a random crime, and we found this had a direct effect on pro-action. So the more they were exposed to hate offences, the more they wanted to go out and join a hate crime action group. And it seemed that this was mediated, first of all, by empathy. There was a positive link between this variable and empathy, which was then positively associated with anger. The more empathic they felt towards the victims, the angrier they felt. And the angrier they felt, the more they wanted to engage in these pro-action tendencies. And now we feel a little bit on a bit surer ground in thinking that these relationships are causal relationships and not simply correlational associations. We did the same thing with a Muslim sample. This time we went into a couple of East London schools. There's some areas of London which had very high proportion of Muslim inhabitants, and hence in those schools. So we managed to recruit nearly 100 school students. So the slightly younger sample age here, on average 15 years old. But same design, we manipulated the motivation for the crime and the type of crime. And again, they read an article which was clearly flagged up as an attack on a Muslim because he was a Muslim. Here's the guy, Mr. Amir Mirza, was attacked, a prominent Muslim leader. It was clear that it was a homophobic attack and shouting Islamophobic speech, and so on and so on. So it's exactly the same idea compared to community leader mugged. Same crime, same effect on the victim physically, but perhaps not psychologically. And also, was it a mosque targeted or just some local buildings? Same idea in terms of the results. Again, where it's a hate-motivated crime, you see a consistent pattern of feeling more empathic, angrier, more anxious, more threatened, certainly in a symbolic sense. And when we link those together, we find again the same pattern of mediation, this time for avoidance. The more you're exposed to a hate crime, the more avoidance behavior you're likely to report. And remember, these are younger kids, these are 15-year-olds, so that's probably why we're getting avoidance behaviors this time instead of pro-action, because what are these kids to do? I mean, they've just got to be a bit more careful. They'll think, I'll be a bit more careful when I go over and take a bus home or in that neighbourhood, because I know there's mainly white kids there. And that direct link here between the kind of crime that they read about and their behaviour seems to be mediated, first of all, by how empathic they felt towards Mr. Azir, and how anxious they then felt, which was then positively associated with their avoidance tendencies. So we've got now the 3 correlational studies that I presented to start with, complemented by these 2 experimental studies. And I think if you take all these together, it seems fairly good evidence that there is a link now between indirect victimization, emotions, and action tendencies. So let me now move to my last remarks and just draw a few conclusions for you. First of all, as I've just said, I think it's now beyond doubt that indirect experiences, particularly of the 2 groups that we looked at, the LGBT community and the Muslim community, indirect experiences of hate crimes against those groups are associated with several emotional reactions. that are somewhat similar. I don't want to say they're identical, because clearly if you are a direct victim, I suspect those emotions are much more intensely felt and probably have longer lasting effects. But nevertheless, in our data, it wasn't always easy to distinguish between the direct and the indirect victims. They're not only correlational data, we have now experimental manipulations which seem to produce measurable changes in the emotions that people feel and the actions they want to do as a result. And as the body of theory that initiated our research seems to suggest, these emotions have these particular action tendencies. It's not just like you just want to go out and do anything. If you feel angry, you want to do these kind of things. If you feel anxious or afraid, you want to do these kind of things. And these last two studies, anyway, seem to suggest that the one reason why indirect victimization, that is, observing or hearing about an attack on a fellow in-group member, generates such strong emotions, is that it may be that we feel enhanced empathy for in-group victims. And there's a little bit of work in other domains which suggests that we find it easier to empathize with fellow members of the in-group compared to people who are not in our group. A few practical conclusions and then I'll stop. I think our research strengthens the both moral and legal arguments for treating hate crime as a special kind of offence, which has its own enhanced penalties and is regarded by the law in a different way than, as it were, equivalent crimes without the hate element. And given that hate crimes seem to have effects on the whole community and not just the individual victims, serious though those effects are, this does seem to suggest that police forces and other organisations need to be thinking about community-based approaches towards addressing the harms of hate crime, especially to reduce levels of threat in those communities. It's not clear completely what those community programs should be, but it might be the kind of publicity campaigns that police should engage in to try and reassure LGBT and Muslim and other victimised groups that they will take hate crime very seriously, to encourage them to report the crimes, to make sure that when victims come forward, they are treated seriously. Sometimes they're not taken seriously at all by the local police and so on, and that has a deterrent effect on victims coming forward, and so on. And in Britain, anyway, we have an interesting aspect of once a person has been convicted of an offence, not just a hate offence, but any crime, particularly a crime involving a victim, so if you've been burgled or assaulted, after the sentences, the person has been found guilty, the victims can come forward and make a statement to the court about the effect on them as victims. So they're called impact statements. And the court is supposed to take account of those victim statements before passing sentence. And there's now some interest in the Crown Prosecution Service now of receiving community impact statements, perhaps from the local imam or from representatives of LGBT community groups, about the effect that a particular hate offence, maybe it was a mugging of a gay person in a particular neighbourhood, had on other members of that community. Again, with the idea of informing the judge before he or she passes sentence on the perpetrator who's been found guilty. And lastly, not to end up on too much of a down note, we are concerned about one of the possible negative effects of hate crime victimisation, which is that it may lead to retaliation. Now, there's one good example of this. I don't know, some of you may remember there was a particularly violent terrorist attack on a young white soldier, Lee Rigby, a few years ago. He was attacked by a Muslim fundamentalist and he was lethally stabbed. And as a result of that, many far-right groups, we could see an instant spike in the retaliatory behaviour of those groups who felt threatened, their group member that was attacked, and then they went out on an Islamophobic spree, and we saw many, following the Lee Rigby murder, there was a spike in the number of Islamophobic offences recorded by the police in the days and weeks following it. So you get this tendency for retaliation. So I think this is something that we need to be very careful of, and that it strengthens our more general argument to take hate crimes extremely seriously because of their corrosive effects on particular communities, but also on society as a whole. So I'll stop there. I have put a few articles here if anyone want to follow up any of the research, the published research now. You can follow these, you can read these in various articles that are included here. But thank you very much for listening, and I think if we've got time, I can very happy to take questions or engage in discussion.
We do have time for discussion now, and I will ask you to use the mic, okay? Rita.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very, very interesting, and actually is very relevant as we often listen to these narratives, and sometimes social media narratives, and even in the public sphere, in the sense that why say it's an hate crime? It could be, it's not targeted for someone in specific, it could be to any other person, and it's very prevalent.
Prevalent. Huh?
Perverse? It has a perverse effect. Reverse effect. And I would like to ask you three things. The first is if you have any data on how these different emotions can be felt in different states. So instead of people reacting or feeling this emotion or this or that one, over time these different emotions may be converted, and in the beginning maybe fear, and this would take to maybe find security, or maybe to try to retaliate, but then an avoidance or a resignation over time. So if there are, if there makes sense to view these different emotions as a continuous process, that emotions can be reconverted in other. The other question is that if we have some data in intersectional effects, in the sense that, for instance, LGBT person from a different nationality, being a man or being a woman, and these intersectional characteristics. And finally, if you have any idea, because I can imagine, for instance, in the social networks and social media, the impact of hate comments online. If you know any studies on the indirect effects, because when something happens like a terrible hate crime, as you show in the beginning, as it was for Bruno Candé, if we start looking at the comments that people do on Facebook or Twitter or other social media, how this can also be measured as an indirect effect for these for the communities. Thank you so much.
Three great questions. First of all, yes, I'm particularly like your first question about whether these emotions actually usually happen in a temporal sequence. We had to elicit them, as it were, simultaneously, and then just measure their associations. I think the next step in our research would indeed be exactly that, to try and see if there's a typical temporal order. Because I think you're right. I think the most likely, your likely guess is, as you said, that fear might well be the first response, and then dependent on the reactions to fear, then that might generate anger in some cases, or less anger, or maybe even shame. So I think that we haven't done it, but we've certainly talked about that. It gets horrendously complicated in research terms to try and track that temporal sequence of emotions. And as far as I know, intergroup emotions researchers haven't yet got to grips with that. Certainly when the theory was first proposed in the early 90s, it was just proposed as, well, we appraise the situation and we feel this or we feel that. It didn't even really consider that they might feel two things at the same time, which is clearly what our participants felt. But I think that is more likely that there is some patterning of the emotional reactions. Intersectionality, we did look at that a little bit about particularly in transgender effects. There's no doubt that double victimization is double trouble. So if you're targeted doubly for two characteristics, it's likely that the direct effects and also the indirect effects are felt more intensely and last longer. What's interesting, of course, in our two groups that we studied, and to some extent there was some tension there, because, as you know, some sections of the Muslim community are somewhat antipathetic towards the LGBT community. And so whether any of our participants will be willing to admit, our Muslim participants will be willing to admit they're gay, is another matter. But there is some anecdotal evidence, at least, and we did have a whole qualitative element to our research where that kind of that intersectional double jeopardy effect, as you say, was clearly visible. Online effects. I think this is what must make now hate crime a particularly problematic phenomenon for the authorities to deal with, because it gets disseminated in seconds amongst millions. And I'm not a great user, I'm not a user at all of social media, but we did have a subsequent study in conjunction with the Metropolitan Police to look at hate crime online. And we got access to a large amount of Twitter data that they had collected, which was potentially harmful data. I was working with some informatics people who would do all this natural language processing to try and extract out some of the hate speech from all the other stuff. And I just sat in on one of the sessions and was looking at some of these tweets, and I could not believe the vile language. I swear a bit myself, but honestly, some of the language that some of these guys were using was just incredible. And we particularly focused on what happened after the Paris attacks. Those dreadful attacks in Paris a few years ago. And there was this enormous spike. You can just see it in the data. Zip, it goes up millions, and then it gradually decays. What we were interested in was, could we observe any association between that spike in Twitter activity and hate crime on the ground in different boroughs in London? And we did some fancy time series analysis, and there was some association. What's not clear yet is which way round it goes. It seems plausible that the Twitter activity then generates the offline activity on the ground, but it's more likely to be circular. Exactly. And to be honest, the kind of statistical procedures needed to look at these kind of recursive effects were a bit beyond me, and then we ran out of time and so on. But yes, I think when we consider how quickly news can get disseminated, compared, say, even back in the 90s when the first, this famous Stephen Lawrence murder, I mean, that got disseminated through conventional media, and that had already bad enough effects or quick enough effects, but now it's almost instantaneous. And of course, the anonymity provided by some social media platforms does much to facilitate the expression of hate online. Yeah, absolutely.
When judging these hate crimes,
yeah, indeed so.
Monica?
Hi, well, thank you for the presentation. I just have a very quick question. It is that I miss a lot the context. So I was wondering things about the geography, for instance, of the samples that you collected. So you have samples in East London, but what about if you did the same study in Manchester or Sheffield or Liverpool? So whether it'd be different or not? And the history of the place. and also the media trust. So whether people actually trust the Herald, for instance, or other sources of trust regarding, so what is the impact of reading things in this particular newspaper? So that's the context that I really needed more.
Well,
thank you.
For our first two big surveys, three survey studies, they were from all over because we recruited, they were online, I think, so people signed up from different community organisations, and they may have been from all over Britain, indeed they were. So they're not confined to particular local contexts. The two other experimental studies were more geographically based. I mentioned the Gay Pride festivals in Brighton, Newcastle, so most of the people will have been drawn from those two areas. I would venture to suggest that we probably have found rather similar results from other major urban centres, Manchester, Birmingham, wherever, London especially. In terms of the Muslim one, yes, it's true, East London, we chose that deliberately because there's a very high concentration of Bangladeshi, Pakistani and Indian communities in those areas. You would find less of those in, say, South London, where it's predominantly an Afro-Caribbean community. So I can't really say much about whether we'd have got different things in different areas, but inevitably in research of this kind, you're limited to where you can find your participants. In terms of the plausibility of the Herald, I don't know. We found it was an online site. It was presented as a very real thing. It seemed to be like an online news organisation, and we'd taken it from. We had no indication. I mean, people thought they were genuine events. Indeed, they were based on genuine incidents. So we had no indication from our participants that they didn't believe them, because although some of them were mocked up, particularly for the experimental purposes, I think they did seem to be very credible sources.
Before that, I do have a question about the sample, which is about the experimental study with the LGBT, that the participants were participants of the parade, right?
Yeah.
So this means that these were people that were already more involved, more engaged. So maybe you would expect a bit of different results with a different.
Sure, and indeed, I mean that same could be said for the online surveys. These were people drawn from, because we relied on our LGBT and Muslim partners to recruit these people. So in one sense, yes, they were a somewhat self-selected sample. But I don't know whether you've ever been to one of these gay pride festivals, but they're fun events, and they have bands and all sorts of activities and stuff. Yes, they are all self-professed LGBT people who, not all, mostly who go there, although a number of straight people go as well, just because it's a fun thing. So yes, there was some self-selection in that sense, but in another sense, I guess it doesn't jeopardize the design itself, because our 80-odd participants were randomly assigned to the different conditions.
Ricard. Rita first, sorry.
Good to see you, Rupert. Thank you for the talk. I got in late, so maybe I missed something at the beginning. I was just curious on two topics that were briefly mentioned here. So you showed a couple of findings of the impact of exposure to hate crimes among the victimized communities. I was curious if you did any research with the same exercise with non-victims, with a majority, non-victim population, and if you would expect that the same or different effects would emerge if people would get exposed to knowing that those hate crimes exist, if they will feel more empathy towards those groups, and they would be more willing to, the collective action solidarity thing, if you have any idea on that, or if you're just focusing on the victim community that were victimized. And related to that, I was just wondering about the comment before about hate speech, which is a whole different issue that may be fueled by hate crimes. And I was just curious about that project that you mentioned with engineers and natural language processing of detecting hate speech, because we were actually doing something similar as well here in Portuguese. And it's very difficult to select what hate speech is, right? So it's a whole, defining the concept itself. So I was just curious if when you related those hate crimes specifically with the proliferation of hate speech online, and you could see that pick, what kind of messages were they easy to detect? Were there more subtle messages in terms of hate speech or not? So just out of curiosity.
Okay, first question, perfectly reasonable point. The short answer is we didn't do any of our studies with non-victimized communities, so I suppose you could argue, well, maybe what we found is not specific to them, maybe they are generic responses. And I suspect that in some cases they may be. I think there will be many, well, I know that many members of the majority group are deeply shocked and offended by hate crime, and indeed that was one of the motivations for bringing them in as legislative innovations, because the governments at the time, it was the Blair government in '97, felt that these were sufficiently corrosive of public trust in the criminal justice system and in society at large to bring in the category of offence. But yes, it's a perfectly sensible and sensible next step. I'm going to plead ignorance for your second question. I mean, these were informatics guys, and they just, you know, they've got their, they have some sort of machine learning process where they get this millions and millions of tweets, and somehow or other they reduce down and they end up with a smaller, more manageable number of, and they're always likely to be hate things, because of course you can't physically count them one by one. So, I mean, I can certainly put you in touch with our informatics people who can, because they're still working on this stuff. And there's a group at Cardiff as well who are also doing a lot of this stuff on the link between online and offline hate crime, which I think is a very interesting and pertinent question.
I was just wondering if that could be the opposite, because you said that majorities could be, you know, more willing to help, but you have the research on hate speech telling us that the more exposed you are, the more you desensitize.
Yeah.
So it could be, you know, Michael Benevitz, you know, work on this idea that, you know, the more you see hate speech online, you know, in social media constantly, you become less sensitive to it, and you really do not detect it. So you actually disengage from it. So it could be this pervasive effect that, you know, the hate crime exists, okay, it gets pumped up in the social media, you have more hate speech, and the more hate speech people see, and if you're not a victim, you become less sensitive to it, and you engage less in it. So it's like, I think the detrimental effects are very dramatic, if you think about it that way. Not only the positive way of being more engaged than helped.
I know the police are very concerned about online hate, and I think their concern is sort of doubled up by the fact that the intractability of the problem, because trying to prosecute online perpetrators is very, very difficult indeed. On occasions where they can actually locate the perpetrator because they live their IPS address or they're located. I mean, it was amazing. This guy, the informatics guy, said, look at this one, and he found one tweet, and he said, this was tweeted at 2:53 in the afternoon in some park in Minnesota. So they could actually find, you know, he said, because he'd left the geolocation data on his phone, and said, that's where it was, that's when it was. So it's incredible, the kind of precision. But yeah, I mean, I think the police sometimes, you know, it's a real issue. And I think it has the effect also on victims of hate crime. So online victims of hate crime feel powerless. They say, well, I can report it to, you know, Facebook or Twitter or whatever, but what can they do about it? What do they do about it? And so they don't. They just put up with it or maybe just turn it off.
Ricardo.
Rupert, thank you so much for this great talk. I just make a brief comment and then I have a couple of questions. So I found the presentation really interesting. I forgot what I wanted to say, so maybe I go to the questions and then maybe the comment will come back to me. So one of the questions was, and I think Rui's question already hinted on that. That is, if you have, you know, thought about, I guess you might have, about the moderating conditions for the link between experiencing victimization, either direct or indirect, and then, you know, feeling threat, but also the link between threat and then the specific emotions. So if you thought about, you know, what conditions might actually facilitate this link or actually hindered that. My second question was concerning the role of anger. So in the model, and I was wondering if this is actually something that comes from intergroup emotions theory or if it's something more specific to, you know, the use that you do of the theory within this specific context. So this role of anger as something that is productive, right? That generates proactive behaviors that might, you know, produce change I think in one of your studies, you do find this link between anger, I believe, and then retaliation. Yeah. So, but my question is just that, right? So when I saw that, I wondered, so is anger always something, positive? So, and what about, the potential link between anger and retaliation? And I have one final question, and now I remembered about the comment that I wanted to make in the beginning. That is, and connected to this thing of being exposed and then becoming desensitized. I was thinking about the fact that in one of your studies, so with the Muslim community, you did not find that link between the direct victimization and feeling a threat. So this made me think about a couple of things. So one was the frequency of exposure. So and whether there are differences between the studies on that, right? So when you get exposed quite some time, you might become resilient, right, to that impact. So whether there's a linear relationship there or not. And also whether it's actually possible for you to conceal your group membership, and whether when that might be possible, you might experience higher levels of threat when you confronted with an incident. And the comment was, and I will finish, was that I think this line of studies, I think, really shows, and that I think it's beautiful, how much we live through others. So what we feel. So it's really social psychology at its core. And then the second thing is asking them that question, whether the legal system actually acknowledges that. I think that's a very important question. So thank you.
Wow. Okay, moderating conditions. I haven't really looked into that, and I'm not sure whether you're thinking about moderating variables like individual difference variables, perhaps.
Perceived legitimacy of group identification.
Yeah, that's the most obvious one I was going to think of. That presumably, those people who are more strongly identified with their group are going to be more strongly affected by the threats against the group. So that's the most obvious one. And we didn't look at that particularly. We did have some measures of identification, but we've just looked at it as just to check that their identity was important. But in a sense, we're self-selecting here. We wrote to the Muslim Council of Great Britain, and most of those people are observant Muslims going to the mosque every week, if not more than that. So the levels of identification will be extremely high anyway. I suspect another individual difference variable, I'm not a big fan of those, but could be, you mentioned resilience. I think some people may be a little bit, as it were, tougher than others. Some people might be more vulnerable. Haven't really looked at that, but I guess there are going to be some moderating conditions of that kind. Coming to the role of anger and retaliation, I mean, that's the most obvious prediction you might make, but although we found quite, I put that early slide up, how often people felt ready to retaliate, of course it's quite counter-normative, because it was like, would you go out there and try and find the perpetrators and beat them up, as it were? No, people aren't going to be readily to admit that kind of thing, even in an anonymous online survey. So that's one issue that we've got there. But in principle, I think you're right. I think that anger is more likely to be linked to some retaliatory tendencies, although we only found it, I think, in one of the studies, that longitudinal one. In terms of this other question about frequency exposure and then the possibility to conceal one's identity, of course that's a very interesting theoretical question. If your group membership is something that is a bit more labile or is a bit easier to hide, then that may have it may be easier, as it were, for them to adopt the avoidance response. It's presumably slightly easier, if you think about sexual orientation, to disguise that than to disguise your skin colour, but not all Muslims are brown-skinned. But we did have some anecdotal reports of people dressing in a more westernised way, as a way of, as it were, trying to deflect in advance the likelihood that it would be targeted. But I think these are all, very interesting questions. As always, why didn't we think of that from the beginning? Yeah.
Just coming back, one question that Ricardo had that I also had. I'm not sure you responded. That I'm very curious. A surprising result of that, the indirect leads to more to threats than the direct, but only for the Muslims.
Yeah, I'd be a bit careful. I mean, that may be a statistical artifact.
Okay.
I mean, there was an association there, and there was the one from the path from direct was non-significant. But it's, I mean, sometimes with these, when you've got these covariances, some spurious non-effects can happen.
And then it wasn't true for the
it
LGBT.
wasn't for the LGBT. We had both driving. And I must have, when I first saw it, I thought that can't be true. But I think if you've got particular patterns of covariance, you can get these paradoxical effects.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I was wondering something about the shame. I mean, there was a link between victimization and shame on the LGBTQ community, but not on the Muslim community.
Yeah.
If I'm correct.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if maybe that's an effect of the familiarity with the aggressor, because it's much more difficult for me to. The effect is stronger if I'm judged by my mom or my dad or my siblings or my family. And it's also more difficult for me to retaliate against them than if someone shouts at me in the street and I kind of dehumanize that person. It's a stranger. And so I was wondering if maybe that lack of relationship between the victimization and the shame could be because of the familiarity or lack of familiarity with the aggressor.
But I'm not sure I understand. I understand why should you be less familiar with the aggressor in the? Are you saying it's less familiar in the amongst the Muslim community?
Maybe I'm being biased, but I think. Well, at least in Portugal, I think we are very proud of not being racist, and we are not very racist in people's faces.
Yeah.
We are on their back,
Yeah.
and so it's much easier for me to be racist and to comment on, make some vile comment based on race or religion to a stranger than it is to make it to a friend of mine or to a member of my family.
Yeah.
And in regards to an LGBTQ person, it could be my sister, so it's much more
Oh, I see.
familiar, and so I
okay.
can much
More easily.
more easily comment and make some.
So, yeah. Actually, I get it.
The connection.
Yeah. I get it. Yeah. So it could be. Yeah. I don't know, but it sounds plausible. Yeah.
And just one more thing, I was wondering if you checked for sex differences in the samples, because men and women are trained differently to deal with emotions, and so I was just wondering.
I'm sure my research assistant did. I mean, I'm sure we controlled for them. I mean, there would have been a control variable. I can't remember ever having any discussion about, and it's not an area that we typically look at, but I think, it's gender, the socialization to dealing with threats could well be different between the genders,
Maybe one final question, Luís?
Hello, thank you very much. My question, I'm not a social psychologist, so my question was about the definition of hate crime that you gave right at the beginning. And my question to you is, do you think that such a broad definition that goes from like an insult on Facebook to a mass shooting in a synagogue is a workable definition of something? Is that then broken down into something more specific? Do you think it's useful to be so broad? And like for the police, for example, do you understand my point, right? It's really, really broad. And is it just an aggravating thing? Or is the crime of I felt insulted and I think it's because I'm Portuguese and that British lady was rude, then I can accuse her of hate crime? Just to clarify that.
Okay,
Thank you.
I think you're confounding, as it were, the motivation for an offence with its severity. Clearly, a mass shooting like that terrible attack in Orlando on that gay club, which had, again, ripple effects throughout the gay community in the world. That was a horrendous effect, people dying and all that. So that should be treated and is treated much more severely in terms of the likely punishment for the offenders and so on. But in terms of the motivation behind it, I'm not sure that it's sensible legally to differentiate between the homophobia that clearly fueled that lethal attack with the homophobia that led to those two girls in that bus getting punched up. Now, I mean, awful for them anyway, but at least they weren't killed. I mean, but the motivation, I think, in both cases is identical, and that's what the law wants to recognise. And then in terms of the severity of the crime, then the law will then recognise that separately. Clearly, a murder will attract a more severe penalty than an assault that will attract more severe penalty than the verbal abuse. So I think we should distinguish between the motivation and the severity, and it's not necessary to or useful to confound the two.
So you think it's good that it's broad?
Yeah, I do think it's good that it's broad, yeah. I want to distinguish, as I said, between the motivation of an offence, behind an offence, and then separately, how serious or severe was the offence.
Thank you, everybody. Before we finish this part of the session and we start with our closing session, I want to thank again Rupert for this very interesting talk and a very interesting discussion. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Vamos esperar minuto que entrem na sala as pessoas que vão tratar da sessão de encerramento.
I saw the ignore. Oh, George could ignore. You were ignoring him. He had his hand up.
Miguel, vamos Miguel. Pode sentar também. Não. Está ligado? Está. Então, boa tarde mais uma vez. Foi uma sessão... Eu estou aqui a fazer de Ana de Almeida, já explico porquê. Foi uma sessão, mas não posso deixar de dizer que foi uma sessão muito viva, variada, estimulante, que começou muito bem, com a excelente abertura da nossa Presidente do Conselho Científico, Ana Nunes de Almeida, que continuou muito bem com as intervenções da nossa aluna, Joana Sá Couto, a animar os colegas para a viagem e a aventura que constitui a elaboração de uma tese e o modo como o ICS apoia os alunos, não é? E os entusiasma para a ciência e para o pensamento. E a continuar com a intervenção do Miguel Dantas da Cruz, enquanto Presidente do Conselho Pedagógico, interino, pronto, mas não interessa, que nos trouxe uma visão em facts and numbers, podemos dizer quase facts and numbers, sobre a quantidade, a qualidade, a diversidade e a equidade de género, muito curioso, temos 80 doutorandos e 80 doutorandas, isto não foi combinado, mas cumprimos este objetivo de desenvolvimento sustentável, que foi também aqui hoje falado, não é? E também de uma oferta colaborativa nos nossos programas doutorais, e depois tivemos os prémios de extensão científica e através de que o ICS, que mostra bem como o ICS valoriza a extensão científica e através disso contribui para a própria sustentabilidade da ciência e da investigação, e o Rui Costa Lopes trouxe-nos os prémios, a ideia, o Presidente do júri que os atribui e portanto tivemos essa parte. Tivemos depois a excelente conferência preferida pelo professor Rupert Brown, a quem agradeço. Thanks, Professor. It was very stimulating, as we could see from the debate. Agora, infelizmente estou eu aqui neste papel impossível de substituir a Ana Nunes de Almeida, que teve que se ausentar por razões de força maior, e a Karen Wong, que também, infelizmente, está com o danado do vírus. Portanto, tenho a honra, de qualquer maneira, de estar aqui ao pé do Sr. Reitor e do Sr. Vice-Reitor, a quem presento, portanto, o professor Dr. Luís Ferreira, que é o nosso reitor, e o professor João Peixoto, que é o nosso vice-reitor, a quem agradeço imenso estarem aqui, sobretudo neste momento difícil em que as nossas chefes estão sem poder partilhar connosco este momento, e agradeço muito e peço-lhes então que encerrem esta sessão.
Então, muito boa tarde a todas e a todos, o professor João Peixoto, a professora Luísa Schmidt, o senhor Presidente interino do Conselho Pedagógico, professores investigadores, estudantes. Em primeiro lugar, gosto de dizer que é um gosto estar aqui. Portanto, estes são momentos importantes das nossas vidas. As sociedades primitivas costumavam ter pelo menos duas festas. Era a festa das colheitas e a festa das sementeiras. E a abertura do ano académico, esta abertura, este reafirmar dos nossos propósitos anteriores e dizer que continuamos na mesma luta e até olhar para novos projetos, é uma festa de sementeira. E, portanto, esta abertura do ano académico é sempre esta festa da sementeira, que nós aproveitamos, dando-lhe uma roupagem diferente, mas é claramente uma manifestação conjunta de propósito de ir mais além, de garantir que continuamos a fazer aquele trabalho que vamos fazendo todos os dias e que isso é importante, não é para nós, é importante para a sociedade, é importante para os outros. E, portanto, não posso deixar de estar aqui, sempre me convidam para uma abertura do ano académico, eu sinto-me mesmo como uma das grandes obrigações que um reitor deve ter, porque deve estar animado desse mesmo propósito de construir o futuro. Os tempos estão difíceis, como nós sabemos. Temos uma crise energética que já se adivinhava lá para trás, veio juntar-se uma inflação resultante de uma guerra na Europa, com repercussões mundiais e que veio agravar todas essas circunstâncias que já nós sentíamos que eram difíceis de resolver, a crise climática, etc. Todas estas coisas. E isto tem repercussões também e de uma forma muito direta no nosso país. Isso mostra também que ainda não estamos suficientemente preparados para crises desta natureza. Quando há 2 ou 3 dias olhámos para aquilo que é a pobreza em Portugal, para os números assustadores, quando olhamos para aquelas pessoas que estão a viver abaixo desses níveis de pobreza e que precisam de uma intervenção estatal imediata para poderem ter aquela dignidade mínima, é alguma coisa que nos deve preocupar a todos. E isto só chama a atenção para a necessidade das ciências sociais e da investigação nas ciências sociais permanente. Qualquer trabalho feito há 3 anos já não responde a estas necessidades. E foram estes inquéritos feitos em cima do acontecimento que nos permitem olhar para esta exigência e urgência em tratar destes nossos conterrâneos, contemporâneos, que tanto necessitam. E isto mostra também a dificuldade que temos em construir alguma coisa que seja resistente a pequenas crises. E nós já nem estamos a viver uma pequena crise, estamos a viver uma grande crise. E na universidade os tempos não vão ser fáceis. Eu gostava de vos dizer o contrário, precisamente. Eu gostava de dizer que, pelo primeiro ano, temos um orçamento capaz de nos encher de orgulho, mas não. O contrato de legislatura que assinámos com o Governo foi rompido, claramente. Porquê? Porque uma das coisas que dizia é que o orçamento teria um aumento de 2% anualmente, exceto se a inflação fosse superior a esse valor. E a inflação, todos nós conhecemos. Eu até dou de barato que nunca nos dariam esse aumento de financiamento correspondente ao aumento de financiamento, mas que não nos dessem apenas os 2,5%, que fica completamente comido, aliás, muito longe, só pelo aumento dos vencimentos. E, portanto, como é que estamos com a energia? Basta-me lembrar que há 2 anos a nossa fatura de energia era de 6 milhões de euros. Para o ano é 17 milhões de euros. Olhamos ainda para o Orçamento de Estado e dizemos que estamos a dar 220 milhões de euros. Mas a nossa folha salarial é de 280 milhões de euros. Portanto, eles não pagam sequer aquilo que é a nossa folha salarial. O que significa que nós temos que ir buscar isto aos overheads dos projetos, temos que ir buscar isto a outras atividades que constantemente estamos a fazer, portanto, desde na área da formação, etc. Portanto, exige um esforço enorme. E mantemos aquelas dificuldades que é a lei continua a dizer que nós não podemos contratar acima do teto de 3%, quando o teto de 3% já está ultrapassado. Já estamos todos em incumprimento, basicamente, em 1,2%. Portanto, não é possível, não é? Portanto, temos ainda leis deste género e que estão a ser discutidas. Eu já tive a oportunidade de dizer a alguns deputados, tendo-lhes pedido audiência, que isto não estava correto, mas continua a haver assim no texto ainda. Portanto, já não faz sequer sentido estarmos a pensar em valores desta natureza. Claro que eu já não vou falar de outras coisas que este contrato de legislatura falhou, quando pensamos nos aumentos salariais do ano passado que deveriam ter sido ressarcidos e não foram. Isto significa que nós já estamos abaixo daquilo que era o orçamento de 2009. E continuamos a lutar e continuamos a dizer, nós estamos aqui, e estamos aqui para responder ao país, e estamos aqui para dar o nosso melhor cada dia, todos os dias. E isto é aquilo que nos move, e é aquilo que nos faz levantar todos os dias e saber que aquilo que nós fazemos é para os outros, é para este país e é para o mundo. E, portanto, eu venho aqui agradecer aquilo que é o vosso trabalho, que no caso das ciências sociais aqui temos o exemplo concreto do quanto é importante a vossa investigação e que sem ela não saberíamos, não tínhamos estes números, não poderíamos decidir de forma tão objetiva como, apesar de tudo, podemos decidir. E, portanto, eram estas palavras que não são, enfim, de grande otimismo, mas de grande pragmatismo e realismo, sobretudo, que eu vos vinha aqui deixar, agradecer muito o vosso trabalho e dizer que naquilo que for possível ao reitor fazer pelo ICS, estará aqui sempre à vossa disposição. Muito obrigado e um bom ano 2022-2023 para o ICS e para todos e todas que aqui estão presentes, incluindo naturalmente e de forma particular os nossos e as nossas estudantes. Muito obrigado.
Não. Não, é que isto realmente substituir as nossas 2 estrelas é difícil, as nossas 2 estrelas ausentes, mas eu queria agradecer muitíssimo a vossa presença e as suas palavras, e dizer também que cá estaremos para a luta e a luta continua. Muito obrigado e até breve.